This is Chapter 4, The Age of Absolute Power, Discussion Number 3, Oliver Cromwell and the Ascent of Parliament's Control of Great Britain. We're going to talk about England, and while we saw that the Spanish Habsburgs and the French were establishing absolute royal dictatorships in their regions, we're going to see how England's fell apart. Now, remember Elizabeth, who was the last Tudor ruler. Her family was called the Tudors, Henry VIII, Mary, Edward VI. And so after she died, she was known as the Virgin Queen. That means she didn't have any kids. They had to go back into the family royal tree and discovered and found a royal heir to the throne, who was James VI of Scotland. He was asked to come rule England, and so he became known as James I. Now, on his way to getting crowned the King of England, he was kind of kidnapped by a bunch of people who said, "We've got a problem with the Church of England. They've got too many Catholic practices in it, and we need to purify all of these Catholic ideas out of the Anglican Church." And he's like, "Forget it. I'm not listening to you guys." And they had like 50 demands. And he looked over the list, and after some badgering, he finally capitulated into allowing one of their demands. He allowed them, or authorized them, that they could produce a new English translation of the Bible so that it could be read by the people who lived in England. This would be known as the Authorized King James Version. And so the King James was actually produced by practically by kidnapping. Now, he originally agreed to work with Parliament as he became King of England, but then he said, "No, I'm appointed by God to be your king, so therefore you have to do what I say." And he demanded the right to levy his own taxes. Instead of hoping that Parliament would give him money in order to do the things that a king is supposed to do, he's like, "I want my own money. And I don't want to have to wait on these guys in Parliament to give me what I'm supposed to have." So that did create an initial amount of conflict. Now, after James I, we then run to Charles I, who tried to also rule as an absolute monarch of England, threw dissenters in prison without trial, and this ticked a lot of people off. He went to Parliament and says, "I need money. We've got an army. We got to go beat up on people." And Parliament said, "Okay, tell you what, we'll get some more taxes for you if you sign this document called the Petition of Rights," which prohibited the king from raising his own taxes. It also prohibited him from throwing anyone in jail just because he wanted to. However, so Parliament said, "Sign it, cool, get your taxes," and then Charles like, "Forget you, go home." And at this point, Parliament was kind of stuck, because the way that Parliament was structured was that the only way that we were allowed to meet is if the king granted them permission. Now, if the king needed money, he'd have to call Parliament in, and then Parliament could to do whatever they wanted to. But if they got sent home, technically they weren't legal to have any meetings. And so when they got sent home, Charles I was saying, "I'm in charge, I've got my money, I'm happy." However, it turned out that he decided that he needed more money. So he said, "Okay, Parliament, come on back." Parliament says, "Wait a minute, you did this to us once before. We're not going to stand for this again." And started making a whole hubbubaloo about making sure that the king listened to what Parliament said, and that Parliament should actually be in control, that they were the representatives of the people. And they were saying some not so nice things about Charles I too. And so Charles I was unhappy, and so he sent members of his army to go arrest members of Parliament. Now, essentially, as the sheriffs were coming in to arrest members of Parliament, those members of Parliament were escaping out the back door, and Parliament says, "This is ridiculous. We should not have to be under threat of our king," and they essentially said, "This means war," and it touched off the English Civil War. Now, the English Civil War is between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. Cavaliers were the ones who supported the power of the king, that the king ought to be able to do what he was doing. The Roundheads were the ones that were supporting Parliament, and generally the Protestant Puritans were on the Roundhead side. Slight little funny note here is that they were called the Roundheads because of their haircuts. If you've ever heard of a bowl cut, where essentially you put a big mixing bowl on someone's head and then you just cut any of the hair that sees, that was the style of the day for the Roundheads. Now, the Roundheads, the Parliament side, were led by a guy by the name of Oliver Cromwell. This man was one of the English's England's best generals ever. Was able to win the war against the Cavaliers for the king. They put Charles the First on trial for being a tyrant and a traitor and being a murderer, and then he was beheaded. So they have no king now. Well, gee, they just killed him off. And so who's going to be in charge? Well, Parliament says, Cromwell, you did such a great and wonderful job of winning the war. You must be really good at running a country. Wrong. Cromwell, while a very good general, had a hard time working politics and working with politicians. And so a lot of little things start happening to make life miserable for people in England. Charles II was supporting a revolt in Ireland and Scotland in order to make life miserable for the English. Levelers were people who were saying that everyone ought to have equal opportunity in English government instead of having favoritism for the nobility, or just plain guys. Why can't girls participate? Puritans were able to dominate Parliament and try to institute social reforms in a lot of those same ways that John Calvin was asked to run Geneva, Switzerland. If you remember, we talked about that in Chapter 1. Remember, it's very difficult to use the power of government to force people to act correctly. And so, the Puritans tried the same thing and they pretty much got the same results. And everything started falling apart on the on Parliament. And after Cromwell died, they're going to realize that they need a different solution. This concludes discussion number 3, Oliver Cromwell and the Ascent of Parliament's Control of Great Britain, of Chapter 4, The Age of Absolute Power.